Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. This is meant to be a tutorial on preaching. So if you would like to preach or you have been preaching but you're looking for some tips to improve, I'm going to share with you some tips that I have found helpful. These are not original to me. I didn't come up with these, but in reading different books, sort of assembled this together. And I can also have a blog post on this on prmarlon.com if you want to read through all these points, and you can get some more information on there. But let's start at the beginning, right? If you're going to preach, the first thing you want to do is to find a preaching passage. And this is very important. When you're preaching, you want to be preaching the Word of God. You don't want to come to the Bible with a sermon ready and then looking for scriptures to support it. You want to start with the scripture. And so this is a very important point. We want to make sure that we start there. And when we start there, there's four things that you want to keep in mind when you're selecting your preaching passage. You want to find a passage that perhaps has a personal impact in your life. This could be something that was especially meaningful to you at a moment in your life and you wish to share that with everybody. That makes for a good preaching passage if it's meaningful to you. Another one is if there is a personal concern. You notice something that's just been weighing on your heart and there's this passage that addresses that and you wish to speak on that. So that's a passage that you might choose because there's a topic that's weighing on your heart and there's just a personal concern. Another reason is a societal need. As you look around yourself at the things that are happening in your society, in your community, and you wish to address something, you might find a scripture passage that deals with that topic, and that way it fits a need that you're experiencing as a society. And another one is a seasonal setting, right? If it's Christmas time, if it's going to be back to school, if it's Easter, if it's in the beginning of summer. So there are certain seasons that certain Bible stories or Bible passages go along with it more naturally. It just kind of fits nicely. So keep these things in mind when you're choosing a passage. Is this one that has a personal impact? Is this one that has there is a pastoral concern for the congregation? Is this something that's related to a societal need? Or is this also something that's more seasonal in nature? Once you find your passage, now we're ready to begin working, right? So there is work involved in choosing the passage, but the real work begins after you chose it. Now you need to study the passage, and you want to make sure that you invest a bulk of your time in this. Because if everything else in the sermon goes well, but you miss the point of the passage, then the whole thing is for naught, right? It just wasted everybody's time if you miss the main point of the passage. So when you want to study the passage, you want to make sure that you're going to be gathering notes, that you're going to be reading the text, and you're going to get a clear idea of what the passage is teaching. So you want to pay close attention to the context, right? So if you're speaking on a verse or on a chapter, you want to look at what verse came before this, what chapter came before this, what comes after. If you're preaching on the life of Jesus, at which point in his life? Is this in his crucifixion? Is this early on in the beginning of his life? Is this, what has been happening? If it's in the Old Testament, New Testament, what books came before it? What books come after it? What kind of what's happening? What's the setting for this passage? That's going to help you a lot with understanding the main point of the passage. And you also want to look up key words. How do you know what's a key word? Well, if it's a word you don't understand, that's a good word to look up. What if it's a word that's been happening a lot, especially in the Gospel of John? There's certain words that John just loves and he uses them again and again. You want to pay attention to those. And there's certain things, usually, especially if you have access to a Bible commentary, usually it'll bring up some of these things. But even from your personal reading, you can find out sometimes the verse will have one or two words that really push the emphasis or the main idea of the whole verse. You want to make sure to focus on those and study those. So here's the thing. When you're studying the passage, one of the things that you want to get, and I'll use a little bit of a technical term here, is the exegetical idea. This means when you're reading the text, what is the main point? This is the big idea of the passage. So what is the main point the key idea of the passage that you chose to speak, this is what would be described as the exegetical idea. And the exegetical idea, if we want to get even more technical, but it'll make sense and it's helpful to use these words, right? The main idea of the passage, it's made up of the subject and the complement. What does that mean? The subject and the complement. The subject, it's when you figure this out, it makes it a lot easier to preach on the passage. So the subject is, what is the text talking about? What is the context? Who is speaking? Who are the listeners? This is the subject, right? The matter that's being discussed in this passage. For example, if you chose to preach on Deuteronomy 31 verse 6, it says the following: "Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you." Right? So let's say you chose this passage. You chose this verse. You're going to preach on this verse on your next sermon. Then you want to ask, do you want to ask, is this a what passage? This a why, a when, a how, where, or who? Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear, not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, He is the one that goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Let's say after looking at this passage, you decide, well, I think why. I think the why is the question here. Then the complement becomes, what is the text saying about the subject? So the subject is, what is the text about? And then the complement is, what is the text saying about the subject? So when you put the two together, you get the exegetical idea. So Moses encouraged the children of Israel to be strong and to be courageous because the Lord was with them and would not forsake them. So why should they be strong and courageous? Because the Lord was with them. So this is when we're putting the whole thing together, right? Deuteronomy was written by Moses. If you're looking at the context, this was towards the end of the life of Moses. They're about to go into the promised land, and he's encouraging them, and he's saying, you don't have to be afraid. You have to be courageous. Why? Because the Lord is with you. So the exegetical idea, right, when you put all these things together, is Moses encouraged the children of Israel to be strong and courageous because the Lord was with them and would not forsake them. So once you have this exegetical idea, now you're ready to begin to work on what you will actually preach. So this has been just the studying and putting together sort of the background, the structure for the sermon, and now you're ready to jump on it. It's why should they be strong and courageous, right? That was the subject. And then the answer is because the Lord your God is with you. So you put these two together, you have your exegetical idea. Now you're going to start to craft your preaching idea, which is pretty much the same thing, but in a language that is applicable today. For example, if I told you that Moses is telling you to, you say, well, what does Moses have to do with me? Moses lived a long time ago. He was with the Jews. How does that even apply to my life? So this is why we want to take that exegetical idea, that full sentence, that main thing that you're going to be teaching in this sermon, and now you want to make it practical, you want to make it simple, and you want to make it memorable. You want somebody to be able to remember what it was that you preached about, and having a clear preaching idea will make your sermon memorable. It means that people will remember what you talked about. They'll remember what happened at church, and it's going to have an impact on their lives. If your sermon is everywhere, talking about a million different things, people will walk away, and if somebody asks them, what was the sermon on? Well, they have no idea. It was about 30 different things. So you want to have a clear, memorable preaching idea. So you want it to be contemporary, you want it to be applicable nowadays, you want it to be personal, something that means something to me, to the audience, and you want it to be concise. You don't have it as a paragraph, it has to be straight and to the point, and you want it to be memorable, something that people can memorize. So here's an example, right? Continuing with the example that we're using from Deuteronomy 31 verse 6, it says that we said that the exegetical idea is Moses encouraged the children of Israel to be strong and courageous because the Lord was with them and would not forsake them. Right? So this long sentence was the exegetical idea. To make this into a preaching idea, we would say you can be strong and courageous because the Lord is with you. Now, there is theological support for this. We are the spiritual children of Israel. The Lord is the same. The promises are still applicable today. So there's all of this support that you figure out with your research and your study of the passage. But when you're preaching, you don't want to be talking just about what Moses said back then. That's important. But you want to connect, what does that have to do with me today? So as the preacher, you want to be able to say, you can be strong and courageous because the Lord is with you. So now I know that this idea, this preaching idea, is faithful to the text because after studying it, I came up with the exegetical idea. Does that make sense? So once I have the exegetical idea, I know it's solid theology. Now I make that transition over to the preaching idea where I'm making it personal, practical, memorable, simple. So here we go. You can be strong and courageous because the Lord is with you. Now, most of your hard work is done. Once you get, and it's hard, I'm giving it to you here fast, but it's hard to come up with that preaching idea, with that short, memorable, personal, preaching idea, something that I can remember, that I can take home, that I can apply in my life. Once you have this done, most of the hard work is already behind you. So now you get to do a few more things that are fun. You want to get this the preaching idea. This is the single dominant thought that is at the heart of your message. And it needs to be crystal clear in your mind. If you are not clear on what you're preaching on, your audience will not be clear on it either. The people who listen to you preach will be confused unless you are crystal clear. And if anybody was to ask you, what's your sermon about? You can tell them in one sentence. It's clear and it's on the tip of your tongue and you know it well. So as you have your idea, you know what you're going to be preaching on, it's clear, you studied it. Now comes the question, what's the purpose for you preaching? Why are you even preaching this sermon? Is it just because somebody asked you? Do you feel a burden in your heart? Do you feel like God is calling you to this? Is this something you want to try? Maybe you're gifted in this area, you're trying to figure it out. What are you trying to accomplish with this sermon? What's the end goal of what you're saying? Are you talking just because you like to hear your voice? I don't think that's the case. So what is it that you want to accomplish? It's good for us to think about this. As you're preparing the sermon, it's not just a performance. It's not just, I studied this a lot. There should be an end goal, a clear end goal. And who will be listening to your sermon? Are you preaching to the church? It's multi-generational. Are you preaching specifically to the youth? Are you preaching specifically to singles or to couples? Is this a family retreat? What are you speaking at? Is this a youth event that you're coming to? So the audience is something you have to keep in mind. So who's going to be listening to your sermon? You also want to consider, what are their needs? Are you speaking in your own town? Are you going over to a different town? Are you familiar with the local needs that the people are experiencing, what they're going through? Are you dealing with a specific subject where there's a specific need? You want to keep that in mind as you're preparing your sermon. And also, and this is related to all the other points, what changes need to occur? So as you're preaching, you want to bring about change. What kind of change? What specific change do you want to take place? And this is something you want to keep in mind as you're preparing your sermon. And then as we are continuing to go through this process and you figure out these answers, you know who you're preaching to, you know why you're preaching, you know what the end result is going to be, you know what change you want to take place, you know who's going to be listening to you. Now you're going to choose the sermon form. Now, there's a few different ones, and some are easier, some are more challenging, but the sermon form should only be decided on once you have all this other work already done. You should already know your passage. You should already know the exegetical idea. You should have a clear preaching idea. You should know who you're preaching to, where you're preaching, what's the change that you want to take place. All these things we talked about need to be in place, and now you begin to ponder, what's the best sermon form to accomplish this goal that I have in mind, this goal that I feel in my heart that I want to accomplish with the sermon. So you shouldn't be trying to squeeze every sermon into the same form. When you're starting off, maybe you're going to be better at certain forms than others. I mean, I've been preaching for quite a while, and I still have my favorite types, my favorite sermon forms. I like to preach, narratives. I love it. It just fits well with my giftedness, I think. But, different people have different styles of sermons that they prefer. So listen to the text. What kind of message is found in your preaching passage? Once again, go back and think through these things that we have been discussing and choose the form according to the passage. So the sermon passage should dictate the form of your sermon. And then you want to search for supporting materials. And this is where there's more research now that's going to take place. Before, you're doing a study of the passage, and there's some research with that, but now you're going to start looking for supporting materials. You're going to look maybe for some news stories that would support your sermon. And by the way, if you're looking at those, make sure it's a reliable source. People can fact check you as you're preaching. They'll take out their smartphones, or if they're watching at home on the live stream, they can just look up whatever you're talking about, and they'll know if you're making something up or if you have a poor source. So make sure you have a reliable source, but start gathering some facts, some quotations, some sermon illustrations. Once again, I find the best sermon illustrations are the ones that happened in my life or something that I read from a reliable book that has been published. You want to make sure you get your facts straight and not just from some video you saw on YouTube or some message that was forwarded to you on social media. No. Look things through before you say them as part of your sermon. But start looking. Look for ideas. Look for a poem, maybe there is a video that goes with it, a news story, an illustration, but make sure that nothing will distract your audience from your main preaching idea. All of these other things should support your main preaching idea. A bad illustration can distract people for the rest of the sermon. They're thinking about the illustration and they miss the main point. So you want to make sure that your supporting material is indeed supportive of the message. You don't want it to be a distraction. You don't want to be something that will take your focus away from the message, but something that will highlight and make it more practical and more impactful. So a few more things. Supporting material, there is no such thing as a good illustration, only a good illustration of something. Be careful not to want to use this favorite story that you heard one time or this news report that you saw and then trying to make that fit into your sermon. That becomes a bad illustration, right? The good illustration is only a good illustration of something. It has to serve your main point. Make sure that the stories are accurate before you use them. Use illustration only if it's going to shed light on the topic that you're preaching. Don't feel like you need to have 3 illustrations or 2 or 5. No, if it fits with your sermon, use it. If it doesn't fit, it's okay to throw it out. Don't force something into the message that just doesn't belong there. And use quotations sparingly. I mean, don't quote for a whole paragraph or a page of somebody else. You don't want your sermon to become the words of somebody else. You want it to be something that you have prayerfully studied and come up with. So you can use quotations to support you, just especially if you have a PowerPoint. Don't do this. I've seen people just they click and boom, there it is, fine print. There's a whole slide full of words. Don't do that. That just it's gonna kill your sermon. And then now we're ready for a big important part of your sermon, which is the introduction. You notice that the introduction is only going to be worked on now, right? Because how can you introduce something if you don't know the supporting material, if you don't know the preaching idea, if you don't have the exegetical idea, if you don't have the preaching passage, you can't develop an introduction. And the introduction should capture the attention of your hearers, especially if you don't preach regularly, if you don't have people who already know who you are or enjoy listening to you preach, or they have an idea of your style. If you're new, you want to be able to grab their attention right at the beginning. This also goes if you're preaching at a different place. Maybe you have your church, you have your community where people know you, but now you're going to be preaching somewhere else. You want to really work with your introduction, especially when I would speak to youth, or if I'm going to a different church, I really spend a lot more time working with my introduction, because when people don't know you, it takes that extra effort to make sure that you capture the attention of your hearers. Also, you want to try to connect with the felt need of your hearers. You want to introduce the body of your sermon, what it is that you're going to be talking about, and you want it to be powerful and intentional. Don't waste words and things that are not going to be going according to what you want to do with the sermon. And now you're ready for the conclusion. So for the conclusion, you want to summarize everything that you said. And it should be a short summary, because it should be one main point and very clear. So you just summarize that. You want to apply it, right? You want to call for action, something specific that people can do, an application. So you want to apply it, and you want to make an appeal that people will actually do something differently because of the message. You're calling them to a change. You're calling them to do something. So you want to make that appeal as a part of your sermon. Also, on your conclusion, you want to word it in such a way that when people leave, when you're done speaking, it had an impact. And that's going to come with your conclusion. So if you have a strong introduction and you have a really good conclusion, even if you get a little lost or mess up somewhere in the middle, it's going to be okay. These are the crucial points: the introduction and the conclusion. What are you trying to accomplish, right? You want to go back to that and make sure that you summarize and you hit on that on the conclusion. And the appeal should be clear, should be concise, and should be specific. And we can talk more about that on a different video. We might have some follow-ups going more in depth into each one of these points. And when you have all of this figured out, now you want to just come together, sit down, and write the whole thing out. I know, sounds like a lot. Write out the manuscript. I find personally that once I am done writing the manuscript, I don't even need to read it anymore. That process of going through writing, it really helps to clarify your thinking. It helps you to transition from idea to idea. It helps you internalize the sermon. So even if nobody will ever read it, especially you don't plan on reading it, that's fine. You should still write it out. If you're serious about preaching, you should write out a manuscript, especially if you're starting out. This will help you make sure that your sermon makes sense and that you know the way that the sermon is going. The manuscript should be a clear sermon form. There should be a single powerful preaching idea. It should be relevant and it should have, relevant supporting materials, and it should have a compelling introduction and a compelling conclusion. So you want to have all of this as part of your manuscript, and you want to write it like you speak. Right? Don't write your manuscript like you'd write a book or an article or something that you would read. You want it to be something for the year. So write it just the way that you talk. Don't worry about the formal rules that you learned in writing class. This is a sermon. You're writing for the ear. So write it in an oral style, the way that you talk. Keep your hearers in mind as you're using your words. The vocabulary, is it going to make sense to them? Especially if you're speaking to children. If you're speaking to people that English is their second language. You want to make sure that the words translate well, that they know, they can understand what you're saying. And you want to remember to repeat the preaching idea. Say it again and again and again. That's how people will remember it. That's how they'll take it home. And the writing does not have to be polished. You don't have to go back and reread it. You're writing mostly to figure out your thoughts. So the writing is helping you make sure that you have the sermon all thought out and that you didn't skip or miss any of these important steps. And then comes, for me, the fun part, which is internalizing. And this is when you read the sermon and you read the sermon again and you think about the sermon and you share it with a friend. And as you talk about it and as you read it, as you write it out, the sermon becomes internalized. Now, I don't mean memorized. You don't want to memorize sermon. It sounds robotic. It's difficult. And then if you forget a part and you get stuck, you want it to be internalized. Something that you can talk about freely. And if you're using a PowerPoint or some sort of keynote or whatever you prefer, that can help you stay on track and move you along. But you don't want to have to be looking at your notes all the time. You want to have it internalized. You want it to be something that you can talk freely, and that also frees you up to make eye contact with the audience and have more of a personal interaction with them. And then listen while you preach. This is something that I realized I never realized how much I would miss it until COVID took place and people suddenly are watching at home and I'm talking to a camera like I'm doing right now. And I realized it's so hard not having the audience there. So when you're preaching and you have a live audience, listen to them. Look at them. Are they sitting up? Are they falling asleep? Are they distracted? And then you can tell by their interaction how your preaching is going. And then you can adjust your preaching accordingly. So listen to your audience as you preach. This has to be a communication, an interaction, a conversation almost. Even though you're doing most of the talking, you're looking at your audience and you're getting feedback from them. So you want to listen to God while you're preaching, right? You want to pray, you want to ask for the Holy Spirit to lead, and you want to be sensitive to that as you're preaching. You want to listen to your audience, your hearers, the people who are physically present there. You want to make eye contact, you want to establish a connection, and also you want to be inclusive. Don't preach to just half of the church or just people who are on this side. You want to preach to everybody. Make eye contact with the person on the very front. Try to make eye contact with the person on the very back. And if you're talking to the camera also, make sure to make eye contact with the camera as well. So be inclusive. Practice this a little bit. It comes with practice, but it makes a big difference when you're preaching. And I would like to finish with a quote from Derek Morris. And he was a preaching teacher for a long time. And he says, God wants you to be a powerful biblical preacher. He wants to anoint you by His Spirit to preach the word with power. That will not happen by accident. You must choose to cooperate with God in a process where His word first changes your own life and then flows through you to change the lives of those around you. So this is what preaching is all about. I hope that you found these tips helpful. And if you like it, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel. And by the way, I might go back and make a little bit shorter videos just expanding on a few of these steps that I kind of went through a little bit fast. So come back and check out for more if you'd like. I hope this was a blessing for you, and may God bless you next time you preach.